Being an island nation, one of the UK's most famous tourist attractions is its coastlines. There are few countries that boast coastlines as diverse than the UK. From rugged cliff terrain to sands that stretch for miles, there's so much diversity that millions can enjoy. There's also a lot of nostalgia. Sandcastles on the beaches, ice cream, fish and chips, the smell of the ocean, and the lingering wonderful smell of fish from the port. I could go on and on. Thanks to advancements in both road and rail, no one in the UK is more than a few hours' travel to get to the coast. But it wasn't always like this. And why did travelling to the coast prove so popular with tourists? To get the answer, we need to go back in time, back to before the modern railway was even a thing. In fact, we have to go back to the 17th century. The Yorkshire town of Scarborough was already old and had seen plenty of history. Its castle and town was in decline following the Second Siege and its fall from royalist hands. But the town's fortunes were about to change. A Mrs. Thomasin Farrer was on the cliffs near the town, and when she found a newly sprung spring. The new water contained heavy iron deposits, staining the rocks surrounding it a rusty colour and giving the water a bitter taste. The iron water was perfect for treating many ailments, and people flocked to the town just to taste the water. The use of spa water to treat ailments was not new, but having both the spring and the sea in such close proximity was a massive allure for many of the rich and elite. Medics may have also prescribed the sea air to many of those living in and around built-up areas. In these areas, the use of burning coal had increased, and so had the air pollution. By prescribing the patients clearer air to recover, as well as the sea's healing waters, it would have been greatly beneficial. One of the most famous patients was King George III. For the majority of his reign, he had been a competent and intelligent king, and had studied sciences and astronomy, and took a keen interest in government and politics. However, the stresses of royal duties, family anxieties, and the American wars placed too much stress on the king, and both his physical and mental health deteriorated. In 1789, on advice from his doctors, the king travelled to Weymouth for the first time. He had a bathing machine made for him. This was, in effect, a portable changing room where he could disrobe discreetly while a horse pulled him to the water's edge. Two female attendants, called dippers, helped the king to bathe in the sea before escorting him back into the bathing machine, where he could again re-robe as the horse pulled him back up the beach, preserving his modesty. Back in Scarborough, the town began to flourish with the spa and began to provide more amenities for the visiting folk. It had a thriving fishing industry, and the population rose to over 6,000 people, which made it quite a sizable town. By the 1800s, Scarborough had established itself as the first ever seaside resort, with a public visiting for pleasure rather than for recuperation. Of course, the term resort back then was very different to what is done today. There are still similarities, such as fish and chips, donkey rides and Punch and Judy, but the adults didn't tend to sunbathe or lay in the sand, as showing skin would be considered undignified. Instead, they used to promenade, basically walk up and down, while taking in the sea air. If the gentry did want to bathe, they, like the king, would change in a wooden hut into bathing suits before entering the sea. Some attractions such as cricket and tennis were offered, and children would go rock pooling, looking for all sorts of new and exciting animals and plants. With the popularity of Scarborough becoming apparent, and seeing the fact the railway boom was thriving at this point, Scarborough became one of the more important towns to get onto the network. Not only were the passengers keen to travel by smooth rail rather than dirty, rocky and dangerous roads, but the town's fish exports could take advantage of the quicker routes. The York and North Midland Railway took charge of the plan, and under the care of the railway king himself, the line was completed remarkably quickly, taking just 1 year to complete the 42-mile route. At the end of the line, just outside the town, was a brand new station. The designer of this station was George Townsend Andrews, who had worked with Hudson before. The station was impressive, considering the majority of the stations at the time were still basic. The long roof spanning the platforms was made of wrought iron and glass and were 348 feet long, and the station quarters had a large booking office, waiting rooms for the various classes, and rooms for the officers, the station master's quarters, and refreshment rooms. Away from the visitors, a large goods yard was erected with a goods shed, and turntables were installed to help turn the engines around. The first train to grace the rails was an impressive 35 coaches long, carrying the gentry and the dignitary, and it was estimated that tens of thousands of people showed up just to see their arrival. And popular they were, especially during the excursion season. The station had to be modified just to cope with the extra passengers. Separate eating rooms were added, and the poor station master got turfed out of his apartment to make way for a hotel with 10 guest bedrooms. In 1884, the station received its biggest modification yet. 2 further platforms were created, and Potts of Leeds designed and built a huge clock tower. It dominated the skyline and added an extra flair to the station. The bank holiday bill had been drafted and placed into law, giving all bank workers certain days entitlement to paid leave. Over time, the bank holiday was stretched to schools, and with it, government offices, shops and businesses. This meant for Scarborough, more and more people could now visit the town. In 1885, the town received a further boost when the Scarborough and Whitby Railway was formed. Instead of connecting to just York, thanks to this railway, Scarborough was now linked to its neighbouring town, Whitby, who in itself was becoming a resort in its own right. Stockton-on-Tees and Newcastle, and now the North. The North Eastern Railway had also opened a line between Castletown and Grosemont via the North York Moors. To accommodate the influx of passengers, an excursion station was built for the NER, adding on to the existing station. But it seemed not enough, as the North Eastern Railway in 1908 built a second station at Lonsborough Road that could take passengers during the peak season, and the smaller station had a through line enabling passengers to travel to Whitby and a bay platform. By now, Scarborough was becoming a railway hub. It had 2 stations covering over 11 platforms, engine sheds that could hold a total of 37 engines, and now a sizable goods yard. It was a lot of lines and signalling was needed, so 2 new signalling boxes were introduced. One was at Washbeck and one was at Fallsgrove. The Fallsgrove box boasted a 120 lever frame. It wasn't the biggest in the area, but it was still pretty impressive. In 1911, petitions were made by unions to include paid holiday entitlement for all the workers in their employment. But it wasn't until 1938 that the Holidays with Pay Act was finally put into law. It was only a week, and it didn't apply to all workers, but it was enough to bolster Scarborough even more. By now, the practice of promenading was getting less and less, and amusements along the seafront were becoming popular, especially penny arcades. But the boom of the travellers coming by rail was sadly not to last. The 1950s saw a new trend in the way people were going on holiday. Coach holidays had been around since the 1900s, but after the war, and to compete with competition from air travel, coaches began to modernise and give passengers luxuries such as toileting facilities. Coupled with better roads and access, this spelt disaster for the railway tourism scene, as more passengers would travel by the roads. The advancement of the motor car also meant that families wouldn't have to wait for the train or be bound by specific timings when going back. Scarborough's railway sprawl began to shrink. Its roundhouses were closed as less and less steam came down the tracks, and the goods yard shut down as its goods were being carried by the roads. The final nail in the coffin came with the Beeching Acts. Beeching closed the Lonsborough Road station, the line between Scarborough and Whitby, and the branch line to Pickering. Even with these cuts, the station was still in decline, so platforms 6 to 9 were demolished, and part of platform 1's roof is still uncovered today. As for the signalling, it was moved to Seamer, The Fallsgrove box was closed and the signalling traffic was moved. The gantry that was near the signalling box was taken down and moved to Grosemont, who at the time reopened as the Heritage Line, using another one of Beeching's clothesline which ran from Pickering to Whitby directly. While the lines were closed, there are still some signs of Scarborough's great railway heritage. The Fallsgrove box is still standing, as well as the bench on Platform 1, touted to be the longest railway bench in England, coming in at a whopping 456 foot long. The goods yard was pulled up and a supermarket sits on the site, but there are heritage trails along the coastline following the same track bed as the engines once used, and the impressive station still stands relatively unchanged, fully basic modifications to allow for new technology. But the main attraction is the Spar Express. This is an excursion train run on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays throughout the summer months. This is a charter train, usually steam driven, giving today's youth the excitement of the style of travelling to the seaside as their grandparents and great-grandparents would have done when they were little. Many famous engines has pulled this exclusive named train, including Mallard, Flying Scotsman, Duchess of Sutherland, Evening Star, Tangmere, the Union South Africa and Galatea to name a few. The Spar Express is one of the oldest excursion trains following the banning of steam in the 1960s. Up until 2010, the route was focused on the Harrogate branch line. The train would start in York, then head to Leeds, stopping at Knaresborough and Harrogate, and then direct to York again before heading to Scarborough. The route was forced to be changed due to a gauging issue on the Harrogate line. It then ran via Wakefield and Castleford. From 2019, the route changed and the passengers would be taken from Carnforth, stopping at stations along the way. Scarborough is a town of my youth, and even today I love going there. I only live about an hour and a half away, so sometimes during the summer, my family used to drive up there after work, just to take in a few hours of sea air, and to get the best fish and chips. But it's the summers of the Spar Express. So during summer holiday, I used to race to the station near to my home to watch the steam train pull in. I loved talking to the driver and the fireman, and even when I took my first jobs, I always timed my breaks to around watching the train go over the viaduct. I have had the pleasure of going on this excursion, and in honesty, there is no better way to travel on holiday.